Okay, for anyone who's on the line early, welcome. We're going to be going live fully and introducing this webinar in about 90 seconds. But if you're on the line early and you can hear me already, feel free to ask any questions in the chat. In the second half of this webinar, we'll be taking questions and doing a live Q&A with an expert group of panels you'll see on your screen right now. Right, Fraser, whenever you're ready, if you want to remove this from the screen, I think we're ready to get started.
Perfect.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you to everyone for joining us on this webinar about negotiating with landlords in the coronavirus era high street. My name is Alex Schalgman. I'm one of the founding partners of SaveTheHighStreet.org, and this is part of a series of webinars and support that we're providing for local businesses as part of our recovery and resilience program. This is actually the first webinar we've actually put live to the wider SaveTheHighStreet.org community. So for any of you joining us live, welcome. If you're part of the 12-week program, your success manager should have been in touch to make you aware of some of the other support that's available to you in regards to this topic, from one-to-one calls to having expert support managing through the process on some exclusive terms that we've got some of the great suppliers, some of which are on the calls today, supporting businesses in achieving the more sustainable agreements they require with their landlords. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to give you a little background behind what we're going to cover off today. But if you'd like more information about this general topic and we're not able to get to your questions, or you're not on the 12-week program at the moment, feel free to drop us a line at info@savethehighstreet.org and we'll get you some more information. During the second half of this webinar, we're going to be doing a live Q&A with our panelists. So if you have any questions at all, you can see on the Zoom, you'll find the chat button there. Feel free to add any questions from now and we'll endeavour to get to as many as possible. Again, if we don't get to your question today, we will endeavour to get back to you afterwards. Okay, so I'm delighted today to welcome three of the most successful landlord negotiators operating in the UK today. I've got Anthony Lorenz, who's one of the founders and the Senior Director and CEO of the Lorenz Consultancy. I've got Alex Hurn, the Founder Director of Sillence Hurn, and I have Fiona Brownfoot from Hicks, who's a partner there. So thank you all for your time. Really appreciate the time and insight today. And I'd like to kick off by asking you all to share a little bit more about your experiences in 2020 to date, and maybe present some context about how COVID-19 has impacted the landlord-tenant relationship on the high street. So, Anthony, would you be able to kick off with us?
Certainly. Firstly, this is my fifth recession I've dealt with, because I dealt with the 74, 84, 94, and of course Lehman's 2008. So this was the fifth one, and this has certainly been the most devastating of all, especially in the retail, hospitality and leisure industry, which started approximately on March the 7th, when a club owner phoned me and said, I take 160,000 a week. I only took 12,000 this week. How do I pay my landlord his rent? So we realized that we had to switch what is basically a rent review, lease renewal and the lease restructuring department into a corporate recovery department. You mentioned this is just a landlord seminar. It's really a landlord, tenant and banker seminar, because there's three people who are in a relationship. There's the tenant who pays his rent, there's the landlord who wants his rent, there's the banker who wants his customer to abide by his banking covenants. And one of the factors which has been really missing so far, but I think it will come in between June and September, whilst negotiations are continuing, is the bankers will have to come out from hiding under a bushel because without help from their bankers, some landlords can't even do a deal with a tenant. The negotiations started early in March, where most landlords turned around, as they invariably do, and said that, you know, my tenant's got a lease. If he doesn't abide by his lease, I'm going to sue him. All right, until they suddenly realise that these tenants just haven't got the money to pay their landlords, and accordingly the tenant turns around and says, "Don't bother to sue me. Where do I send the keys to?" Right, and the whole success, right, of all the negotiations which are going on, and we're handling at least 100 at the moment, if not more. The whole success is actually going back to the high street or going back to central London, as is most of our work, and actually seeing the stage setting look something like the stage setting looked like before the curtain fell, and shops, offices, restaurants, bars, clubs, casinos were even forced to close. All right, and that's never happened before. So the first 2 months of our negotiations was convincing landlords that they were actually on the Titanic with us. All right, and that if we don't row the boat together, nothing is going to work. Most landlords start talking about deferring rent, but that's just kicking the can down the road. And the tenant who's in trouble at the moment, the last thing he wants to do if he's paying, let's say, 100,000 a year, is to have another 50,000 a year he's going to have to pay on top of next year's rent when he's not going to be able to do it. So we don't see deferment as really much of an option, and that the real negotiations are either waiving rent or rent-free periods, or actually reducing the rent which is paid so that a landlord doesn't actually lose his tenant. What we are seeing is that landlords are beginning to realise that if they are playing hardball, they're going to end up losing their tenant and be then wanting to try and let a property in what will be a very, very thin market of operators. We even saw Select Service Partners announce this morning that they're making 5,000 staff redundant. They're the people who sell food in all the petrol stations, etc. And they've been a client of ours for years, and they were an incredibly successful company. And the business just isn't out there for them to actually pay their rents. And so we're going to have to see a massive adjustment. Thank goodness the government announced that we've now got from June to September, where landlords can't actually send in the bailiffs or serve winding up petitions and force their tenants into liquidation. The most important thing is the dishonest tenant causes a problem in the market. If a tenant really does have the money to pay his rent and it hasn't been affected by the coronavirus, then he should be paying the rent. And we do try and take on cases where there is a real problem. We also act for landlords, and we mirror image our advice to landlords as to tenants, whereby if a tenant isn't going to be able to pay the quarter's rent, if you can get even a month's rent out of them or 2 months' rent out of them, that's better than getting nothing, because landlords are taking the risk of their tenant actually defaulting on the March quarter day, defaulting on the June quarter day, and then going into liquidation or going into a CVA. And I think I've said enough, and I ought to hand over to other panelists.
Yeah, so for Fiona, do you echo, or do you have any different experiences from the last few months?
I think we've seen the whole range of things going on, from absolutely nothing happening, no concessions at all, through to landlords who've actually done, I feel, as much as they can, and that is usually giving a complete rent-free period, certainly from the March quarter, and in some instances we're seeing them already giving it away in the June quarter, so that the tenants will have benefited from 6 months rent-free. But as Anthony pointed out, because we have got the third partner in this, which is the funders, and that situation of being able to grant a complete rent-free period, whether it's 1 quarter or 2 quarters, is only possible where a landlord doesn't have the pressure of a funder sitting on his case expecting payment for effectively his mortgage on the property. So what happens in the negotiations is very much dependent on the landlord's position as to what he can do, which is why my advice always to all tenants and all landlords is do what you can. Again, as Tony said, there's a number of occupiers who actually can perfectly well afford to pay, and who haven't, and who should have done. So, you get that scenario through to, it's usually actually, I find the smaller retailers, the ones who are really trying to pay their way and pay what they can. So you're having the whole gambit from nothing happening to, say, 6 months complete rent-free, which I think is as far as you could expect any landlord to go. So we're seeing the whole range of things.
Can I just pick up on one thing that Fiona mentioned, and that's the mathematics of the whole situation. If you take a property which is held at 100,000 a year, all right, the value of that property, if it's a 5% investment, is actually £2 million. All right, you multiply by 20, all right, to actually get a 5% return on a property. And where the tenant's only asking for £50,000 from his landlord, which is 6 months rent-free, in order to save him, his landlord's property is then going to be worth 1.95 million instead of 2 million. And it's actually petty cash to the landlord, right? And why doesn't the funder then come in and say, look, instead of you having 70% loan to value, I'll increase the loan by an extra £50,000 and you can give the £50,000 to the tenant. Yeah. And unfortunately what's happened is the banks have stayed very much in the background so far. I think the banks only start coming in when they see that their customers are going to default, and the customers only go to the banks when they see that their tenants are going to go into liquidation, and that's where the main problem lies at the moment.
Alex, do you want to build on this or talk a little bit more about the general perspective you see in the market at the moment?
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think because we deal with all the commercial property sectors. I mean, I think the one where the retail is so different is where you don't really have you don't have as many big corporate massive bodies owning the properties. So the landlords you're usually dealing with can be just private landlords or singular persons. So, I mean, taking into account, as Fiona touched upon, the landlord's position is key. I mean, if they can't get any break or relief from their fund or a lender, then obviously you've got to completely take into account their position. And if they can't get any mortgage holiday or breaks, then obviously they've still got bills to pay themselves. And I think where we've seen the best results so far is where pure transparency has been given by both parties. So I think the tenant, really, it's key to get a real sort of business case, good argument there. Even like a basic profit and loss account sheet there showing basically what the percentage of your rent used to be against your turnover compared to what it is at the moment, and kind of negotiating new terms from there, really.
Okay.
If I could add,
two Anthony Lorenz is on the line. Anthony, you got your alter egos joined. It looks like. I think we'll crack on. Just again,
I'd love to meet him.
As a whole, what I'm kind of keen to characterise here is, what if you have been impacted by COVID-19? What could you aim to be achieving here? You know, as a business on the high street who has had their sales drastically hit through what's been going on, what are the outcomes that you're seeing that are possible? And rent-free period was touched on. What are the other outcomes that you're seeing with tenants you're representing, and outcomes you're aiming to achieve with other tenants?
Well, there's only one outcome, which is a common factor throughout every single negotiation, and that is tenant survival. All right, and the outcome we don't want to happen, all right, is the tenant having to go into a CVA or otherwise go into liquidation or go into administration. All right, and every single case is different. And as the previous speaker, and I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, mentioned, the most important thing of the lot is what's called transparency. And the reason why professionals are handling these negotiations is we need, when immediately we take instructions from a tenant, we give them the list of what the landlord is going to want to hear. And what the landlord needs to know is the following, and it's very simple. Number one, how was your business doing if coronavirus hadn't happened? What was your path? Number two, what have you done, right, to cut all your outgoings, to take all the government grants, to furlough your staff, etc., in order to minimize your outgoings while you've been closed? Number three, what are your prospects of opening and when are you going to open? Number four, what is your cash flow looking like at the moment? And number 5, have you got a chance of surviving if we do give you help? All right, what help do you need in order to survive? And that actually is based on the forecast going forward of how the business is going to be. If you take a pub, for example, and you have to take into consideration social distancing, which has got better recently, because we've gone down from the 2 metre to the 1 metre, hopefully, social distancing. But how long is it going to take to build this business up? We act for a major casino group and who've got 3 major London casinos and 8 provincial casinos. And they're not going, even with the roulette wheel spinning in September, they are not expecting to get back into previous profits until June 2022. There's also the social mentality as to whether the youngsters are going to be allowed by their parents to go to clubs, bars, restaurants, casinos, and the like. Right, so there's a different mentality which we've got to take into consideration. There's the social distancing. There's the fact that you may be trading next door to 5 empty units, and you know all you've got is charity shops around you in the high street. And will you be able to trade the way you used to? So you've got to give where you've come from, where you are, and where you're going. Right, and if you're not transparent with landlords, you can't expect the landlord to give any help. All right, and in the same way, the landlords, and for example, we deal quite a lot with land securities and Aberdeen Asset Management and quite a lot of the larger landlords, and they are asking the right questions. And it wouldn't be a bad idea if your business really showed, right? And I can send you a detailed questionnaire, you know, of what landlords have asked of my clients. All right. I think tenants should be very well prepared not to just say, my business is closed and therefore because it's been closed for 6 months, I want 6 months rent free. That is not the way in which to approach a landlord. You have to explain where you've been, how the virus has affected you, what you've actually done to keep your costs down, what is your business plan going forward, what are your expectancies, and if you are going to get help, what help you need, and how that help is going to allow you to survive.
Okay, so Alex, Fiona, Tony's laid out a sort of process here that he follows. How does your process differ to this, if at all? And also building on it, you know, within the process, what does it take? What are those skills that you learn from experience of negotiating these situations that actually enable you to get those outcomes for your clients?
I mean, sort of general principles of how one needs to go about. I would say, I mean, obviously the points that Tony's outlined are all appropriate ones, but as sort of general things, I would always say be honest. Be clear about what you're looking for. It's no good just saying to your landlord, oh, I'm having a tough time. You know, be clear about what it is that you could need if you can, you know, you do need to demonstrate, as Tony said, your sustainability of your business for the future. But, you know, you need to to be honest about it, be clear about it, but also have empathy. Have empathy for your landlord, and landlords to have empathy, obviously, back for retailers. But I think that element is missed sometimes. Is, you know, the tenants are saying, well, I've had no income. Well, yes, but if you don't pay your rent, then your landlord's not having any income either. So you're both in the same boat. So that's why it's so important to be honest about your situation, and both parties need to be honest. You know, if you've got a landlord who doesn't have any funding, then they have a lot more freedom and a lot more flexibility to agree different terms, as opposed to a landlord who has got, you know, pressures of funding. But say, and being honest on both sides, being transparent, being clear, and have empathy for each other, and just try to see each other's point of view. As general principles, I think that's what we need.
And getting specific, Alex, what are the specific things you see working with, again, a lot more SMEs and in other sectors as well? You know, what are those specific things that you can get to with these discussions which actually have an outcome for your clients, have a positive outcome?
Well, I think we'll kind of all sing off the same hymn sheet in respect that it all comes down to the fact that we are in unprecedented times, don't we? No one knows where we're going to be next week, let alone next year. So it's kind of it is just kind of appealing to a landlord on that wavelength and saying, look, we share business interests. We need to have a sustainable business relationship. Obviously, we will be transparent with you, but you need to be transparent with us. So it's really getting down and just dwelling in a bit. I know you want a specific case, Alex. I'm obviously dwelling into the sort of presenting the actual business case, and obviously Anthony gave his step-by-step guide. Obviously, it's just, I always think it's a good exercise for the retail tenant to provide like a really basic profit and loss summary sheet. Have a look at where their rent was pre-COVID. Have a look at where their rent is now, and get a feel for where they think it's going to be in 6 months, a year's time, worst case and best case. That will allow you to sort of think about where you want to be, and also think about if things started to get back to normal. Potentially have a look at your lease. Is there a break clause coming up? Would you want to stay at that property if everything was back to normal within a year, so you've got a break in a year? Or would you want to use that as leverage? So if you want to stay there, could you use that as leverage and extend your break for another year, potentially to give you some leverage on the negotiations?
I want to go back to a point that was raised a bit earlier about empathy with landlords here, because there's maybe I think something we can kind of touch on here, which is more about how are the landlords feeling and coping through this period on the other side. All of you have represented landlords as well as tenants, but also you've got insight from both sides of the table here. How are the landlords dealing with this situation?
Right, can I start? Because I love the fact that Fiona mentioned empathy, which I missed out completely. All right, and the empathy comment from Fiona is absolutely paramount both ways, and it comes from landlord to tenant and from tenant to landlord. And this is why it's so much easier, all right, for a professional who's an outsider, who's dealing with his client's money, right, as opposed to the tenant who's actually already struggling with a million other things, including how to keep his staff together if he's ever going to reopen. That most of our clients have got 100 different issues they're handling, and we've only got one issue that we're handling. And empathy is absolutely paramount, almost to start the conversation with the landlord, saying, I'm sorry I've got to phone you, I'm sorry I've got to talk to you, all right, but as you can understand, your tenant who we're acting for is in difficulty, all right. And it's almost like getting down on your knees, and sometimes it's the worst sort of work that I've ever handled, because when somebody takes a property, all right, the landlord's happy, he's let it, the tenant's got his new property, the banker's happy, we all go out for a glass of champagne and celebrate. And this is almost like being an undertaker and having to actually handle negotiations in an atmosphere of a funeral, because everybody's losing. And it's a matter of how each of the losers share the cake. And how are we finding landlords on the empathy side? They're beginning to get to grips with it, right? And the most important thing, which was said by the other gentleman, was re-gearing leases. Landlords do want to see something back, if they can, for the rent-free period they're giving. And if a tenant has got a break clause in June 2021 and could serve notice in December 2020, those are the easiest cases to deal with, because the landlord would give them a rent-free period anyway to stay on, especially in the market that we're going to be going back to. There's also the possibility of turning around and saying, give me 6 months rent now, and I'll put an extra year on the lease for you. There's also a possibility of actually getting somebody to improve the covenant of your lease by giving some form of rolling bank guarantee. If your bank is, that's only with the larger tenants, your bank is prepared to give an annual bank guarantee against the money you've received. And you've got to realize as a tenant that this is not just a one-way street. This is a street where the landlord doesn't want to lose 100%, the tenant doesn't want to lose 100%, and the banker doesn't want to lose 100%. And there's got to be a lot of give and take as well as empathy, all right? And the tenant's agent has to understand what the landlord needs to achieve. We've taken out break clauses. We've even gone on to index linking, all right, on one rent review. And we then get on to whether we have RPI leases instead of rent reviews, and you might be able to give an RPI uplift on a rent review. We've just renegotiated a casino in central London, where we went from standard rent reviews to RPI or rent review, whichever is the higher. And the landlord gave a very substantial rent-free period because it improved his investment value. So the good advisor needs to understand not only what the tenant's position is, i.e. his lease, he's also got to understand the landlord's investment value and how you can help change his investment value, which will then endear him to help. But also, as Fiona said, done with empathy right the way through. And this is a time for conciliation and not confrontation.
So Fiona, but back to you, and thinking about different types of landlords. You know, high street's quite fragmented. Some high streets owned by local authorities, some's owned by institutions, some's owned by bigger families with lots of assets, some's owned by individuals. How are you seeing types of landlords reacting to this situation?
I think generally speaking, the smaller the landlord, the more amenable they are to have a discussion. I see one of the comments that have come up on the chat is that somebody has said, this is, you know, it's all very well, all that's being said, but it does rely on communication as well. And obviously one needs one's landlord to communicate and you need one's tenant to communicate. They both need to communicate if there is to be empathy. I couldn't agree with that more. So, and I have found, generally speaking, it is obviously the smaller ones who have, I would say, if I'm to generalise, have been more accommodating and happier to have discussions. Again, if they have the freedom to do so, they're even more keen to have a discussion. It's perhaps more difficult with the pension funds, partly because of the volume that they're dealing with. I mean, they will be dealing with, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of tenants and having the same discussions with them all. So volume is a bit of a barrier to having perhaps the kind of conversations with the larger landlords that otherwise you might have with the smaller landlords. So that's a generalisation.
And when we talk about, you know, the overall outcome is about sustainability, it's about survival, it's about making sure that, you know, businesses have what they need to be able to, you know, succeed on this next stage of the high street. But more specifically, maybe Alex, you can maybe paint a picture around, you know, what are the specific requests you're putting to landlords? You know, rent-free periods was talked about, but what are the other things that people on the call could be thinking about as potential asks of their landlords?
Well, yeah, just generally on your how a landlord's feeling, Alex. I think they are generally they're feeling like they're getting a hard time with all the government legislation and bills that have been passed, the insolvency bill, all of the landlord powers have been capped. So the sort of smaller private landlords feel like that they've been left exposed really, and their investment isn't protected. So, I mean, they don't want an empty building at the end of the day. It's the worst time for a retail property to be empty from their respect. And they don't want the tenancy to end. As long as you've been a good tenant, you've been paying your rent on time, you've been complying with your lease, they would want that business relationship to continue. So in respect of what we've been asking for, I mean, I think Anthony evolved on kind of what I was saying last time, is that we've done a few cases where we've re-geared leases, so where we've extended break clauses another year, extended leases generally. You could even waive and look at, on the covenant side of things, about maybe losing a bit of dilapidations liability, maybe changing your repairing liability so you don't have that burden of costs at the end, or maybe even saying if the property is in really bad condition that you as the tenant would agree to redecorate it next year on the basis of a rent waiver or a rent-free period. So there's a couple of other tools in there you could use potentially to save yourself a bit of immediate rent.
Okay.
The other tool, there's just one more tool available, just to throw in, because it hasn't been mentioned. In a lot of cases, obviously, when tenants originally take a lease, they'll have put down a rent deposit. So that's another tool in the box that can be used, where the landlord can access the rent deposit to recoup the rent that isn't currently being paid and agree not to have it topped back up again. So that is a possibility if there is a rent deposit in place. Obviously, that is a tool that can be used.
We've
Just to throw that one in.
We've actually already had two or three of those where we have voluntarily given landlords the rent deposit instead of them having to serve notice. there is a situation that landlords are trying to grab rent deposits, especially when their tenants could go into liquidation. Instead of the liquidator actually grabbing the rent deposit, especially before the quarter day, which was happening, and quite a few cases were a rush to the line on that. But it's a very good point, Fiona, that rent deposits are not very much use to a tenant. And funnily enough, when the lease expires, the fact that the landlord holds a rent deposit makes it much more difficult for the tenant to argue that the landlord's being unreasonable on dilapidations, because he's got to get his money back from the landlord instead of the landlord actually trying to get the dilapidations money out of him. So I do recommend a tenant to work where he has got a rent deposit, to actually suggest to the landlord, why don't you withdraw a certain amount out of the rent deposit and I'll top it up when I can.
Okay, we're going to get into questions from the audience in a second here. So if you've got any, make sure you put them into the chat comments. Looks like we've already got a few here. Just while I'm going through these questions, has anyone from the panelists got any views about the announcement from yesterday for Boris, build, and any impact this might have?
As a panelist, I'll give you the impact that it will have, right? I've been working for a long time on the fact that the high street in a lot of cities around Britain was doomed before the coronavirus started. And most high streets have got a major shopping centre, and the shopping centre should be used to get their kids the kids to drag their parents back into town, right? With for example, art classes, and with, for example, musical entertainment, and to go and watch the local football match in the basement cinema, for example, so that people can be together, right? And the retail industry was already beginning to be doomed with loads of charity shops, etc. And the more development of built, we've got a massive housing shortage in the country. And Boris has announced today that build. Yes, you can change. You will be able to change the planning from a shop into residential very easily. All right, and the planners should not obstruct it in future, and they shouldn't be as anal as they've been over the years about trying to get planning permission. That unfortunately runs against our negotiations, because there's so many more landlords who won't care about having an empty shop in the high street, because he can actually benefit by having the empty shop by converting it to residential. All right, and I think the announcement is very, very poorly timed, and all right, and could cause a lot of problems with regard to tenants trying to negotiate against their landlords.
Okay. Well, we can come back to that. But Fiona and Alex, have you got any further thoughts on this that you want to get across? Speak now.
I just think that there will be circumstances where it is appropriate to do that, certain high streets, but there'll be a lot of high streets where it isn't appropriate, a lot of retail units where it won't be, and that you need to maintain them in the retail use. But I think we'll also see some wholesale redevelopments, the likes of Maidenhead at the moment, where the shopping centre the planning application is in to actually knock down the whole shopping centre, 1960s, and to rebuild the town centre really with much less retail. And that's predominantly what we need in this country, is we need to condense the retail that we do have into the smallest area that's feasible within town centres, and those areas that sit on the periphery, those are the ones that are more appropriate to be converted to residential.
Right, we're going to get into questions from the audience now. These are big topics, and we may well get back to them towards the end. And if anybody's got any specific questions around Boris's announcements and some new government legislation coming in September around this, feel free to chuck them into the chat box on your Zoom screen. So the first question is from Dominic Steed from Sporting Feet. I'm currently about to try to negotiate my 2 new leases. The question is, are landlords being realistic and accepting significantly reduced rents?
I can comment on one that I'm just dealing with at the moment where, again, it all comes down to whether the landlord can or not. But just as an example of what is going on in the marketplace, where we've just agreed something where the rent is now half what it was. So previous tenant to be paying 170,000, we're just agreeing it at 80. So, but that landlord doesn't have any funding, so he's got the ability to have complete freedom and be able to be completely pragmatic about what he can accept. The situation would be very different if he had, you know, if the equivalent of a 75% mortgage on his property as it was valued prior to the pandemic. He just wouldn't have that ability unless he's got a great big deep pocket of cash. You know, there just isn't the flexibility to allow that to happen. But then you've got to look at, well, what happens if he doesn't allow it? And if you actually do get a retail unit back, the chances are you will go for at least 12 months without any rent coming in, if you can find a new tenant, and that remains to be seen. So, you know, really they're really caught between a rock and a hard place. And, you know, as we've said, we need the funders here to stand up and be counted and say what stance they're going to take. Are they going to allow some holidays, rental payment holidays for landlords? Are they going to extend terms? Are they going to increase loan to value so that the landlords can take some cash out so that they can give the cash to the tenant? So it all depends. You know, the answer will be different depending on who your landlord is and what their funding situation is, unfortunately.
Alex?
Yeah, I'd imagine that Dominic, I mean, he mentioned in the question that it's 2 new leases. If they've recently been signed, I'd say he's in quite a strong position if he's got 3 years, 5 years potentially left there until he can break or his lease expires, because obviously he's got the landlord will want him to stay and pay that rent, really, because he's got a reasonable, probably a good tenancy in what was a bit of a dodgy market. And I think, like Fiona said, putting that back on the market now, they would probably struggle to get the same rental value or deal over the line. So yeah, I think that Dominic just needs to follow the kind of outline advice we've given, really, and make a valid business case and go to the landlord with transparency and empathy and see how he gets on. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll move on to a question from Phil here. I'll sort of paraphrase some of this. So quarter days, January, April, July, and October. Didn't pay the Q2 in April, and landlord has since offered me a quarter rent holiday. So next quarter's due on 3rd of July, so a couple of days, end of this week. My turnover since reopening has been hit, so it's 1/6 of what it was, and it only covers part of the staff on furlough. And the landlord says he can't reduce the rent any further now that my new rent only covers his finance. What to do? Should I pay on July?
I noticed that he says, should I pay? So I'm kind of assuming from that he could pay. And again, this all comes down to, you know, the advice that I give to landlords and tenants: do what you can. So if he is able to, I would encourage him to do what he can, and if he can pay, then do pay. If he feels his landlord has made as many concessions as he can make within the parameters of his constraints of funding, then the tenant, if he can, should, is my view.
Well, this is going to be fun, because I'm going to disagree with Fiona for the first time, all right, slightly. There's poor old Phil has reduced his rent. His turnover's gone down to 50%. All right, or less than that, all right? And even if he can pay, the government have extended their moratorium from June till September, so he doesn't have to pay. And what he should be looking at is, and I agree with the could pay is a very questionable word, Fiona, all right? He's got to look at what his forecast is going to be now that he's running on his 50% business. Right, and if he's going to have to pay the full rent, right, if he's running on a massively reduced turnover, he's going to put himself in trouble. So I think the right thing for Phil to do is actually go back to his landlord and said, look, I did negotiate with you in good faith. I've got quarter days which are somewhat different to the quarter days throughout the country, which is March 24th, June 24th, September 29th, and December 24th. I am due to pay my rent. You need to speak to the landlord beforehand. I'm very much appreciative of what you have done for me, but my turnover is still down, all right, and can I possibly pay you a month of this quarter, all right, even though you can't collect it from me anyway, because the government has stopped you doing that for another, and to pay what he can pay rather than to pay the quarter day's rent, because he might need some cash flow in order to cover him for his loss of business. So I wouldn't recommend paying the full quarter's rent. I'd recommend the landlord to go with empathy the tenant to go with empathy to the landlord and say, look, thanks for what you've done. Right, I was hoping that life would be great when I opened up. I've now opened up and it's not great. Right, and I'll pay you what I can. Right, but I've got to keep some cash flow to keep the business going. All right, not to put himself under stress because he has got the government protection. So I sort of go along with Fiona, but not to pay the full quarter day's rent.
Anything to build on that, Alex?
Yeah, I think that's sensible. Going back to monthly would help hopefully alleviate some cash flow worries. I think not paying at all is a very dangerous line to tread for any tenant really, because obviously although landlord's powers have been seized till September, I mean, no, that debt is just accruing. So I mean, at the end of September when the bill comes to an end, we obviously don't know how the courts are going to look at it at the moment if they go down the debt recovery litigation avenue, landlords, but it's just debt accruing on account really. And there may be other elements in the lease where the landlord could recall some money, i.e. through the rent deposit or a guarantor, if there's a guarantor on the lease. So it's be careful with not paying at all.
Okay, I've got a question here from Joanna that I'll sort of kick off with here as well. So Joanna's basically asking, saying that there's a lot of aggressive landlords where she's operating and sort of dealing with tenants who don't have English as the first language, fear the cost of asking a lawyer for help, and that's what's needed. But what the businesses are finding is that agents in between are very aggressive because a lot of their core business comes from fees in finding new tenants to drive them. And I think the first thing I'll say, Joanna, is, you know, for the businesses, I think it's in Chiswick where you represent, if I remember correctly, you know, we need to get them some information about the support that's available, whether it's something like a copy of this webinar for starters, but also, you know, access to some of the one-to-one calls that are going on with experts, and some of the new packages of support, which are in some cases are completely no win, no fee. So trying to get that managed support available and affordable for all the businesses. I don't know if anyone else wants to sort of build on this from their experiences of challenges tenants have faced with agents. Clearly not agents on the call.
Of course not. But as you mentioned, Alex, you know, you through your organisation have been making available. You know, I've been giving my time on a Friday afternoon for the month of June for people exactly like Joanna to call in at completely no cost. I give my time freely to provide advice. So we can discuss whether we want to continue that on for this month. In which case, you know, Joanna could have access. Appreciate it would be difficult to pay other professionals for the advice you need at the moment when money is tight, but it is exactly why, you know, Save the High Street have been doing what they have been doing with providing that support. So hopefully that's something that she can take advantage of so that we could have a one-on-one to discuss that.
And anything else? Any sort of cautions from this, or should we move on?
I would add that if Joanna is in a parade of shops, to actually speak to her neighbours and canvass them, so that she can try and get 6 or 7 people together who may then be able to afford to fund, all right, a little bit of advice, all right. And when Joanna thinks she needs lawyers' advice, the lawyers' advice isn't actually needed on most of these cases. The web is full of information with regard to what the government have allowed. All right, landlords cannot attack their tenants for rent at the moment. They can't be aggressive with them. They can't send in the bailiffs. They can't serve winding up orders. They can't serve stat demands. But they can turn around and they can say, "I'm not prepared to reduce your rent. I'm only prepared to defer your rent." And if a landlord does say that, he does risk all of his tenants leaving, right? And maybe he doesn't want Joanna in the shop, right? Maybe Joanna should be actually looking elsewhere to relocate to somebody else's shop where there is a decent landlord, and she can actually move 3 doors down the road to an empty shop and actually jack in her lease and just go to a liquidator if she can't afford the rent. Because you can't force landlords, unfortunately, to be reasonable if they're not reasonable. I detest landlords who are not being reasonable in today's market, because we're all in this together. The landlord, and I've seen quite a lot of questions about when are the bankers going to come in. Well, they're hiding under a bushel at the moment, and that's going to be the answer to that. So it's really landlord and tenant for the moment. But I pity Joanna, and any help we can give. If she wanted to make a call, we could advise her what to do. But I really think that Fiona giving her Friday afternoons free is the most wonderful way to do it.
Good. Alex, shall I jump to Nicola's question, or did you want to jump in there?
No, I was just going to add on what Anthony said. I mean, I think getting a solicitor or a lawyer involved also is probably unnecessary, but it also gives the wrong impression and can make things a little bit too litigious, a little bit too early, and may put the landlords back up a little bit more than it should be.
Yeah, good. Okay, so Nicola's question sort of builds on points around empathy. So she says it's difficult to have empathy with a landlord who you hear nothing from except payment demands. The owners are so far removed, we just cannot negotiate when we aren't dealing with them directly. There is one contact who doesn't seem to have any authority to negotiate and simply says no. So what happens in this situation here? I'm thinking back to when this whole period of COVID kicked off, and those first communications happened, did you get a response from people who can make a decision, and how?
So jump in. I think, unfortunately, we are going to have the raft of landlord reactions, and there will unfortunately be some completely and utterly unreasonable ones that you can't talk to, you can't have a discussion with. You're dealing with an asset manager possibly who's been given a remit by the remote landlord just to say they've all got to pay. That's it. End of. That's just a completely unreasonable landlord, and as Anthony said, really difficult to deal with. If they won't communicate, if they won't be reasonable, it is really difficult. All at the moment you can rely upon is that they can't take legal action against you. But of course that is really just kicking the can down the road, because when that restriction is lifted, they will still probably, that sounds like they're the kind of landlord who will be after you the minute they can with statutory demands for the unpaid rent. And I think unfortunately there's very little you can do about that in those circumstances. I just make sure when it comes around to lease renewal, don't renew your lease, move somewhere else, find a different landlord to have a better relationship with.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think that they will be, as Fiona said, that they will be the first landlords to take immediate action as soon as they've got their powers back, because they would have done so already if they could. So yeah, I think it's you're going to get them characters, and it's just like Fiona said, try and maybe see what options you've got to relocate, to be honest.
I can give a wonderful answer to Fiona. Fiona, you've completely stumped me. I don't know how to deal with an impossible landlord either, all right? And if they're impossible, they're impossible. And the advice you've been given by my other 2 colleagues is probably the best thing to do, all right? And if your business really is in trouble, all right, put the boot on the other foot and just pull the plug and liquidate the business, and then start up another business, as long as you obviously haven't got personal guarantees or rent deposits or whatever, all right? And if he's putting 2 fingers up to you, put 2 fingers back up to him, because this is not the time when landlords should be difficult.
Okay, I've got a question. Looks a bit more like a statement. We're going to read it out anyway, from Anne-Marie Waris. I'm familiar with landlords who prompted the discussion and offered rent holidays before being asked, based on being emphatic. Challenge is that this then appears to be seen as being too kind, and then let's take advantage. You want to interpret that? Quite sure.
I can do this one. The Grosvenor estate came out in April and offered all their retail tenants in Mayfair the March quarter day rent free automatically. Argent followed them, and then you've got Blackstone, who are a very, very tough American fund manager who bought all the railway arches, who went to all the railway arch tenants and gave them 3 months rent free. And it was actually kind of a sprat to catch a mackerel. The landlords hoped that by giving the 3 months rent free, that would be it. All right. And most landlords end up giving 3 months rent free after a lot of negotiation. So I'm not saying don't look a gift horse in the mouth, but I'm saying you are still in the same negotiating position. You've been given your 3 months rent free period, and you are still now in the same position saying, thank you very much for having given me my 3 months rent free period, but that doesn't really work for me. All right, I've taken it gracefully and I really thank you, but here's my business case as to why I can't actually pay you in the future. All right, and I know it sounds like it's being unappreciative, but a lot of the landlords gave out the 3 months rent free, knowing that they were kind of giving sweeties to their tenant, hoping that the tenant wasn't going to approach them first.
Okay, I'm going to move on to another question. So I've got Sarah from Oxford. There's a question above that. We're going to aim to sort of cover that offline. It's quite a long question to respond to. Sarah Weirden has asked, in Oxford City Council has expected 100% rent, no conversation, and the university has been asking in some cases for rent rises. Independents are working together to support and rectify the position. I'm going to be feeding back from this meeting, all extremely helpful, thank you. But any perspectives from the panelists on the call around that situation? Not even talking about rent reductions, rent waivers, we're talking about rent rises in this market. Are you seeing that anymore?
They just need to look at their lease and see whether that's actually permissible. I mean, it's the first instance. It seems rather surprising. And rent rises as a general thing, if they are part of a rent review mechanism in the lease, have to be justifiable. So the landlord would have to prove sort of beyond reasonable doubt that there's sufficient comparable evidence to support a rent increase. So that you just need to look, they need to look very carefully at their leases to see what terms are specified as to whether that is even possible from the landlord's point of view.
I'd also advise actually creating a real campaign of all the local retailers, right, saying that the local council is being completely unreasonable, all right, and also go to your local MP as well and possibly try and stir up some political help against the local authority. Right, and I find it absolutely amazing to hear that the local authority are actually not even bothering to try and help any of their tenants, and they're going to allow them to go bust wherever they do go bust. I think that's a disgrace.
I've got a second question here from Sarah, just sort of bolting on. So if our rent is £2,000 a month, what might our landlord's mortgage be? He has many properties in Oxford, mostly student properties. We paid 50% rent and had 50% deferred. Feel this is totally not fair enough, though. And I'm in the process of communicating with him. We've been transparent, but they are not willing to at this stage.
His mortgage is probably £160,000, right, against a value of £240,000. Because your rent's $24,000 a year, is probably 10% property or thereabouts. Right, that's worth £240,000. He'll have a 70% loan to value, which is £160,000, and he will be paying probably about, I don't know the exact rate on the mortgage. He'll probably be paying about 4% of £160,000, which is 1632. He'll probably be paying about £6,400 a year against your £24,000 a year coming in.
Looking at the other element though, if he's a student landlord, HMO landlord, he will probably be a bit higher geared levels on that, higher loan to value ratios on those properties, and obviously those aren't probably producing income at the moment due to no students. So obviously there's a little bit of empathy there in respect to that element, but that's just taking it all into account.
Okay, I've got a question from Donna. I had to take on a full repairing and insuring lease 10 years ago, as the landlord spent a lot of money on roof repairs before we moved in. I'm actually technically out of lease right now, and we're negotiating, and were negotiating already pre-COVID-19. Should I try to change the basis of the actual lease now, as in not full repairing?
Obviously, she's got the advantage at the moment, I would suggest, in the current market. It is definitely going to be a tenant's market. So if she is, at that point of renegotiating a new lease, then obviously it's potentially a blank sheet of paper, and it's for her to negotiate the best terms that she can. And now is the climate, I would suggest, in which to secure something like that. Obviously, it's always resisted by a landlord, but we're going to see all sorts of terms, I believe, that have previously been established as part of commercial letting that we'll start to see fall by the wayside. Even things like upward-only rent reviews, argues on assignments, level of rent deposits, how long they're held for, and repairing obligations. I think we'll see all of those things being questioned and negotiated much harder than we have previously.
I think Sarah's got a really complicated situation. Number one, she's got a liability if she exits the property on the full repairing and insuring lease for the roof, right? But number two, the landlord wants her to renew, and therefore, as as we've just been told, that she's in a very strong negotiating position. And what I would advise her to do is to do what's called a schedule of condition on the roof, right? Whereby you actually get a building surveyor to do a schedule of condition to say that on the new lease which she's going to take, she doesn't have to put it in any better condition than the existing condition as she finds it. And the landlord lets her off her dilapidations liability under the existing lease, so that she then goes into a new lease not having to keep the roof in any better repair than it is at the moment, right? And I think Fiona would agree with that might be an extra thing to advise her to do.
We've got a good problem here. We're about to run out of time, and we've got lots of questions still to answer. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, if we don't get to your question today, if you could please put the question in an email to info@savethehighstreet.org. And what we'll do is we'll follow up with more information about the different kinds of support that's available, whether it's a kind of one-to-one call to cover this, whether we can get that question just answered via the email, or whether we can give you some access to some support that's suitable to you in terms of actually achieving what you've got in that particular request. So I'll say it again, info@savethehighstreet.org if we haven't got to your questions today. We do have quite a few questions still here. I think it would be useful, though, to give the panelists an opportunity now to just share their top tips. What are the things that you're seeing in the market that you can share with local independent business owners on the call today, in terms of actually achieving positive outcomes to help build a more sustainable lease and relationship with their landlord? So I don't know, we'll start with you, Fiona, whether you can give us any tips, one or more.
Okay, I think it's just going back to things I probably said during the course of this, really, which is to be honest, be transparent, be empathetic, and communicate. And I think if you apply those principles, hopefully, in the majority of cases, though not all, because not all landlords are going to behave reasonably, as we've spoken about, but if you apply those principles, hopefully, it will lead to what both parties want. And I think that the best type of negotiation is where both parties walk away and feel they have got something, they have both got a benefit, and that is the best type of negotiation we could have, and hopefully that's the sort of negotiations that tenants can come up with. Give their landlord something in return for what the tenant probably wants, which is to preserve cash flow.
And I will add to Fiona's saying the definition of a good deal is one where both parties are moderately discontented, all right? That they both feel they've given something away. I agree with everything that Fiona said. I think she's absolutely brilliant at the way she puts herself across and what she does. And thank you, Fiona. And the other thing which I would advise you to do certainly is where the government actually protects you against having to pay the June quarter day rent. Definitely don't pay the rent while you're in negotiation, because you will lose you'll lose the one negotiating tool which does work for you, right? That if you could pay. Even if you could pay some of the rent, hold it back for the moment and then offer maybe 1 month or 2 months against a quarter day as part and parcel of your settlement. between June and September, because I very much doubt whether the government will again extend the moratorium from September to December, because they will have given 6 months for people to negotiate. And so I think July is a very, very important month in which to try and do a deal with your landlord.
Yeah, we're emphasising exactly the same thing. Alex, final thoughts from your side?
Very much of what the other two experts have said, really. I mean, it's really just down to good communication lines and transparency, and really spend as much time as possible on that business case. Make sure that you're sharing as much information as you possibly feel comfortable sharing with the landlord, so they get a real picture of how your business relies on the property, and also the impact the rent has on the costings and the profitability.
Fantastic. So I want to just take a moment to thank all the panelists for sharing not just their time, but some fantastic insight with everybody today. And for everybody who's taken the time out to join on this webinar, if you need anything else, please do get in touch with us. Either if you're on the 12-week program, get in touch with your success manager. If you're not, drop us a line at info@savethehighstreet.org, and have a fantastic day.
And thank you, Alex, for your time. Without you, it would never have happened.
My pleasure, Tony. Thank you. Speak to you soon, everyone.